kind of inflation's kind of off the radar screen. And I think that's probably a mistake. And on top of that, you have a kind of psychological phenomenon. I kind of lived through the Japanese bubble of the late 80s. And there were a lot of people who were confident the Nikkei was overvalued at 25,000. There were even more people who were confident that it was overvalued at 30,000. And by the time it had gotten to 35,000, there were a lot of people with humility who weren't confident of anything. And so I think the fact that predictions of inflation have been wrong for a very long time, obviously, is a probative fact on the one hand, but it's a fact that can be too probative. So I think the concerns about inflation accelerating, the concerns about expectations, which we don't understand very well, becoming unanchored, the concerns about what could happen to the dollar, I think in environments which you don't understand very well, it's a good idea to take small, careful steps, unless there's a compelling reason to do something else. And so when I look at an 18% of GDP deficit in a year when unemployment is predicted to be kind of like it was in 2015, I kind of think I'd rather see the energy pushed forward over the longer term into things that I know will do good in terms of public investment. And that just seems to me like the better approach. I think Paul and I agree and probably disagree with Charles Goodhart in thinking that the right best guess, considering all the forces, is that the idea that savings absorption is our principal macro problem is likely to be right as a way of thinking about the next decade. And it's just a question of, if you have that, how much should you be putting into place a program for the next decade to address that? And how much should you be doing all of this right now? It's like the question I think I referred to earlier of, if you believe in an increase in the minimum wage, how should you feel if somebody wants to increase it to $22 for the next 2 years? You kind of like the idea that they're on your idea about increasing the minimum wage, but maybe this isn't the best way to do it. And that's where I come on the judgments now.
Yeah, can I just say, I mean, Larry and I are actually in many ways in similar wavelengths, and definitely, just because something has been true for a long time doesn't mean it will always be true, and things do come around. And but it's also true that in some ways, if we're worried about an unhinging of expectations here, this is an extremely the sui generis nature of what's going on is some insulation against that. Seeing us run huge deficits in the face of an unprecedented pandemic is something that I do believe even that people, wage and price setters, financial markets, and so on, will largely treat as being a one-time event. I could be wrong about that, but I think the idea that it's going to suddenly be 1978 in people's minds again that's too far. If we continue to run, if we continue to do massive, diffusely targeted programs after the pandemic is over, well, then that would change. But I don't think that's going to happen. And just a word about the Goodhart point. I just worrying that this is stuff I'm actually supposed to know something about, and that sort of thing drives me a bit crazy. The fact of the matter is 70 to 75% of the workforce is in non-tradables. That the idea that wages are depressed that we are unable to have labor organizing because of Chinese competition in our vast service sector really doesn't make sense. If you try to ask, why is it that why did Walmart not get unionized when it took over from General Motors as the biggest employer? That wasn't because of globalization. You can't drive to a Chinese big box store. It was because of essentially because of politics, because the giant service sector companies got giant largely during the Reagan years, and where both legal and illegal tactics to block union organizing were essentially given complete freedom of action. So no, I don't. If it's possible that the low inflation environment of these past 3 decades is behind us now, but not for the reasons that Goodhart is saying, and mostly I think not, because basically I come back to it. I was vastly persuaded by Larry's secular stagnation argument. I think that we have a lot of persistent economic weakness, beyond this, beyond the COVID relief into the post-COVID world. It's going to be we're going to be back in the world we were, which is when we're creating enough demand and avoiding slowflation is going to continue to be the big problem.
Look, maybe a summary of some part of this, Marcus, is I think in some ways, Paul and I are in very substantial agreement. I think Paul and I both believe in 2 propositions. One, we should have a effective response, maximally effective, to winning the war against COVID and protecting its victims. That it's likely that will have been accomplished within a year, and that beyond that, we need a large-scale, effective program against secular stagnation. I think Paul is more confident than I am, though we're equally hopeful, that the current program will be the first step down that road and is the best way to move us down that road. And I am more concerned that the current program, because of its various overhangs, will become the defining program of this era and leave us less responsive to the overall secular stagnation challenge. But I think that our disagreement on that point should not obscure our agreement on a fundamental point where we are still at considerable variance with many in the economics profession and even more in the financial establishment, that our fundamental issue of our time is the absorption of saving. And it is that, rather than the rise of Chinese labor or some kind of promiscuous profligacy on the part of central banks, that is the way to understand the major economic trends that are playing out.
Thanks, Larry. So, Paul, I give you another minute to respond, and then I will conclude.
I think that's exactly. I mean, the truth is, we'll find out. I think Larry is. I think you're exaggerating. I think you're wrong. I'm not exaggerating. I think you're excessively worried about the risks, but I'm not sure of that. I'll admit that I'm not sure about that. And but it's a peculiar thing, because although this debate only started very recently, it's already pretty much moot. In fact, something that is, it now seems unlikely that it will be as small as 1.7 trillion. It's actually this thing is going to pass. It's going to pass with Kamala Harris's vote, and it's and then we'll find out. and hope that it can be managed. And then you're right. I mean, I'd say actually the overriding issue is, of course, climate change. But the way to deal with that and simultaneously deal with the problem of secular stagnation is through a lot of public investment. So this behind us, that's where we should be going, and we'll see whether this massive thing, it is massive, whether this massive thing paves the way for that or gets in the way of it. And cross your fingers and hope that the optimistic view is right.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure to talk to you